welcome to episode 77 of the PowerScore LSAT podcast. This is Jon Denning in Los Angeles.
And this is Dave Kaloran in Napa Valley.
My man, the end of a very long week. How you feeling? How you doing?
I'm feeling quite tired, if truth be told here.
Which I guess I should spring right into what you're drinking, because I suspect that's had an effect.
No, that will energize me as the night goes on, and I suspect that I'll be drinking many of these. But tonight, I'm having a Colorado Bulldog.
Explain.
That's just a White Russian, but you add Coca-Cola to it. So I wanted more caffeine out of this. So you just basically have vodka and Kahlua, and then, bars use cream, but that's just way too heavy. So I put milk in there, and then you add a couple of ounces of Coke to it. So it's kind of jazzes up the flavor a little bit, makes it a little bit more effervescent.
That's really interesting. I don't normally think of a carbonated soft drink going great with milk, but you do you, man.
Surprise, surprise, right?
Surprise, I'll have to try
I'm
one.
full of tricks.
Yeah. Next time I get up your way, you can pour me one. I've gone even simpler. I've been chugging coffee and it may literally, my life depended on it. And I realized we were about to record this, so I spruced it up a little bit with some Jameson. So
kind of a classic for you. You like an Irish coffee.
It was just slapdash, man. On 11th hour, grab some booze. Let's record situation.
I know both of us are fairly fatigued. This has been a long 5-6 days, however long it's been since the LSAT started on Saturday.
Yeah.
Feels kind of relentless. In that relentless vein, we've chosen, I think, a great song by one of my favorite bands. But I feel like I've been put through the search. And the song is Strip Search by Faith No More. Which, Faith No More is one of those bands that either you love them or you're like, what? I think they're great. And this is, I think, off Album of the Year, which is the name of one of their albums, which is one of my all-time favorite albums, John. And I doubt you knew that.
I did not, although it would have been a pretty safe guess. This is right in your wheelhouse of tunes.
Did you know that Mike Patton, the guy who is the lead singer of Faith No More, has the documented greatest range of any male rock singer?
I did not know that. I did read something pretty recently, though, and I forget who did it, Rolling Stone or something, where they were looking at the greatest octave range on recorded tracks, and Axl Rose actually had the greatest.
Did he really? Because I thought it was Mike Patton that had it.
No, Axl was number one, above even Mariah Carey on that. Interestingly enough, he sang a note in some song that's a lower frequency bass note than anything else that they have on record.
I'm going to have to check that out because that's updated information to me, and I don't like it.
There you go.
I prefer Mike Patton to have that title.
Yeah, you thought you were going to blow me away with some trivia. The tables have turned. The student becomes the master.
Oh, the turntables.
They are a great band, though. A rotating cast of members over the years. Each one, I think, has become successively an improvement. So, yeah, good call on that. And it has felt like we've been doing strip searching, trying to get all this information together. And frankly, I feel a little violated myself. It's just been incessant these past several days. Yeah, with people plying us for information or trying to get it out of us. So there we are.
A lot of people doing that.
Yeah, we'll come to all that. Let's take a broader view first. What's going on in the LSAT world?
A couple different things aside from the LSAT itself, but I think a few pieces of news that are really useful for anybody listening. First off, I sat down with LSAC last Friday and had a lengthy conversation with some of the people in their admin. It was very productive and helpful. And one of the things that I directly asked them about is when are we getting new LSAT dates? Because right now we've got January, February, and April LSAT dates announced in 2021, but we don't have any information after that. And of course, there are going to be more test dates. So they said to me that by the end of February, they would announce the next several exams. Not all of them, I don't think, but I think the next several. And part of the reason for that, there may be others, is that, again, they'll have to make a call on whether or not they're flex tests. And I don't think they want to make the decision on the entire year. I personally think, and they did not confirm this, although I did ask, I personally think they're going to be flex tests. I know you agree with me on that. It's just going too slowly from a recovery standpoint, at least in this country, to imagine that by June or July that we're all of a sudden be like hanging out all together again.
That is true.
Sadly.
I was going to ask if anything about that conversation you had with him had changed your mind, changed your opinion about what these next several tests over the summer are likely to be. It doesn't sound like it.
No, we've been saying that for a while, that we think they're going to be flex tests. So I'm using my own speculation here. This was not confirmed.
On a happier side note, both of my parents are getting vaccinated today, actually.
Wow.
Yeah. Augusta, Georgia beats California to the punch. Who'd have thunk it?
Also, I believe your parents are in that zone where they're among the first receivers.
Oh, yeah, they're ancient. So
I won't tell them that you said that.
I'm half quoting. My mom was like, well, the good news about being this old, we're first in line. I was like, yeah, there you go, Mom.
I wouldn't want to hurt her feelings, though. She's so sweet.
She's a sweetheart. So, yeah, they're getting their first dose today, and then 28 days later, they should be at least mostly in the clear. We shall see.
You know, there's a movie about zombies called 28 Days Later, and I didn't like the way you referenced it there.
We'll let that one go. But I do know that movie, and it's great. So there's another bit of LSAT trivia that we should probably pass along, or at least some data that you've been able to gather.
Yeah, there's two further pieces of information. The first is, I just want to remind everybody, do your LSAT writing. All right, as of just a couple days ago, over 10,000 people still had not taken their first shot at LSAT writing. And remember what the rule is here. If you have not taken it, you don't get your score. All right. Kind of like concurrent with that, if you do have one on record already, you're in the clear. You don't have to take a second one. You don't have to do one for each test. You just need one. So if you have one, you can get your score. If you don't have one, no score for you. And we're probably still a few more days before there's an issue with this, but I would do it immediately.
Yeah.
If you can, try to do it this weekend.
By issue, you mean people starting to run up against a problem of getting their scores on time.
Yeah. They said to me that they saw a burst of people taking it last weekend, but part of the problem with that was they also saw a rise in the number of flag sessions. And the easiest way to get through this is to do it soon and to do it cleanly. So just as a reminder, when you look at this, remember that you want to show both sides of your scratch paper to the camera. You can't wear a smartwatch. You need a very clear photo of yourself, with your ID, no military ID, as I recall. And then you can't have a cell phone or something like a backpack sitting on the bed behind you. Those things will all cause you to be flagged. I think last time I checked, they were running somewhere around 25% flagged, which is way down from when they started this months ago, but still higher than what they'd seen before. So I think just keep in mind, you want to clear everything out, get anything that might be a violation. Some of those are minor. They just slow you down. Some of them, like smartwatches, are catastrophic. They will cancel your LSAT writing.
It's just an instant redo. Wow, with something like that. Clear the desk is what I keep telling people too. There was a guy who got flagged and ultimately cleared, but it delayed him weeks because he had a smart television remote on his desk. I guess they thought it was a cell phone or something. It was an LCD screen TV remote where he was taking, I guess maybe like on the table or something. And they just didn't know what it was. The AI flagged it. Nobody could tell. He explained himself, but it delayed him like 9 days, I think, before his score was eventually approved or released.
He needed to watch ESPN during his session.
I think it was very important that he changed the channel halfway through.
He had a lot of money on one of the big games.
So, yeah, just be smart about this. They'll process it pretty quickly. You still have time, but don't let this go into the last minute. That's where we see this panic right before score release.
Yeah, and again, if you're concerned about what to do about the writing, there's a couple resources that we put together. First off, we did a podcast episode on it. It was episode 15, so you can listen to that where we talk about how to go about it and what to write. And then also, there is a blog post that is kind of like a collection of resources that we put together. It's called The Ultimate Guide to the LSAT Writing. So look for those if you're like, what should I do or how should I do it? We've talked about that. Both of those are free to you to access.
Yeah.
The other thing here, John, is that unbeknownst to me, but they gave me the information recently, LSAC has expanded their phone hours, which I thought was, if I had been them, I would have announced this in much bigger terms. But they are now open from 8:30 a.m. to 8, I think, p.m. Eastern time on weekdays, and 12 to 4 on Saturday and Sunday. Again, all Eastern times. The comment that was made to me is that apparently nobody knows they're open past 6 o'clock Eastern, so the call volumes are really light in the evening.
You can get right through.
Yeah, which is exactly what that is. So if you have a problem, you need to talk to them, call them between 6 and 8.
Yeah. The comment I'll make to you is that's a very strange way for you to start a sentence. Unbeknownst to me. I was like, wait, what?
It was just one of
However,
those
yeah,
things.
it was kind of a quiet charity here, which is not their typical MO, but I'll take what I can get.
Yeah, I had not realized that occurred. Now, maybe they did announce it, and I'm just like, my head's off in the clouds of dealing with the LSAT, and I didn't realize it. But this is a good piece of information, and now you've got a little, pro tip. Call them between 6 and 8. That's when they're seeing very light call volumes. That's an exact quote right there. So don't
like
call
it.
Monday at 8:30. That's when the call volumes are super high. I understand. Call them at 6.
Yeah. So there you go. Some urgency to a few things, some general tips about some other stuff. Let's talk about the matter at hand, the January LSAT.
The January LSAT. And at this point, we're recording this Thursday night, the primary test-taking group is done. So we've gone through all the main test days. The international LSAT has gone through, which we'll talk about. And then the paper and pencil accommodations tests are all at least underway, if not almost all completed at this point. Sometimes they take a little bit longer. So this was a big test.
Yeah, it was.
Around 27,500 was what they kind of estimated. The volumes have been much, much higher originally, well into the upper 30s. But as we've been talking about on recent episodes, that's been coming down. This was Saturday, Sunday, and Tuesday were the main days. About 9,000 students each day. It was anywhere from about 8,000, 8,500 to 9,000. And then today, which was the accommodated testing day, was about 250 people. So much smaller group overall. And of course, Monday and Wednesday were both, Monday was a holiday, and Wednesday there was no testing. So two kind of off days.
Yeah, I'll clarify too. The 250 who took it today with accommodations, they had a very particular type of accommodation, which set them apart. There were plenty of people with extended time, say, who took it over the weekend, who took it on Tuesday. Today, I think, was a lot of paper and pencil tests and other sorts of like very unique proctor situations.
Start-stop accommodations.
That kind of thing, yeah. But that's why today was so much smaller, blessedly so. But it was hot and heavy there through the first half of the week.
Yeah, and I think that's probably what we'll see in the future is just kind of talking to them about this. That's about the maximum I think that they want to sustain is that 9,000 in terms of the number of people taking it. And I talked to them throughout the weekend and indeed throughout the week. And I will say this, knowing how many people were in this testing group, you knew there was going to be some problems.
Sure.
But my personal feeling was, even though some of the problems, as always, were definitely like adverse, this was overall one of the better administrations to me. And mainly because it was so big that when I saw issues, sometimes it was delays, and there were a few catastrophic issues, but they seemed to have a new plan for how they're going to handle retakers. So if you had a problem, of course it was terrible, and we understand that. I'm not trying to downplay that or make light of it. It's just that on the whole, I felt like this was like they settled in a little bit, and they're like, we have this going on. There's also a lot less pressure on people who are retaking, because it used to be that they did it the same week, and they had to have a turnaround of decision-making that was so fast that everybody involved was kind of like, it was a fraught process.
Yeah, there have been makeup tests offered for every flex so far.
Yeah.
It's just typically they have been Friday, the same week as the test itself. That's an awfully quick approval and turnaround process. It's also awfully tough to get your head back in the game on a 36-hour notice or whatever it might turn into.
Exactly. And now that retaking window has been pushed into the next week. So if you're retaking the LSAT, you are doing it on Thursday, January 28th. So a lot of time for them to say, hey, we can work with you on this. The urgency goes down. It makes it so people aren't calling them every hour to say, what's the status, because they're able to look at it and be like, all right, they have some time to make a decision here. So I think that was a really smart decision. Obviously, for us, it pushes our kind of observation of this test out further, but I'd say there's a fairly good chance that the people who take it on Thursday don't have the same test as what we just saw. No guarantees there either way, but I would be surprised if they did.
I would too, especially since a lot of the people taking it next Thursday saw at least some portion of what this week's tests were. It'd be weird if they sat back down to the same content again. It'd be
Yeah, so if you're a
worse than
retaker.
weird, frankly. Weird doesn't begin to do that catastrophe justice.
Yeah, it is terrible when you start, and you never know what it is. Sometimes it's a proctor. I had people had the internet go out. Some people saw their power go out, completely beyond anybody's control. Fortunately, there is a safety valve here, and that's what the retaking is for. I know you wanted to talk about a very specific issue that we saw.
Yeah, one of the things that I kept seeing come up on our forum, talking to students elsewhere, had to do with a very specific incompatibility between certain Macs, whether the hardware or certain iOS or OS systems with the Mac, the software, operating with the ProctorU program. And what it seems to me to be, the diagnosis that I was able to draw out from this, was that ProctorU has you download a program called LogMeInRescue, which is a bit of a clunky name, but what it allows ProctorU essentially to do is to take control of your computer, to turn off certain features like screenshotting. And when that wouldn't download correctly or wouldn't actually run on a certain OS system on your computer, OS system, super redundant, sorry, a certain OS, then ProctorU simply couldn't access your machine and couldn't approve you to start the test. So for instance, the OS Big Sur, which I think is one of the latest Apple releases, 11.1, there were notable problems for people with that particular system installed trying to do LogMeInRescue. The advice that I would give you is, instead of fretting about this, is try to do some pre-test work where you actually go into the ProctorU system, you download the stuff, you see if it works, you get in touch with the proctor a few minutes before your test, so don't push it, and just make sure that everything checks out. I didn't see anyone who was just permanently unable to take the test, but I did see some people with some severe delays.
Let's talk about that, the severe delay and the possibility of a retake. Everybody knows that these things are going to happen, and it's terrible when it does, and it's super frustrating. That's why they've done this retake system. It's nice that they pushed it back a week so they can actually make some decisions without the pressure of the immediacy on it.
Right.
So it is public knowledge that this is going to happen. I will point something out, though, because I had people asking me like, hey, I had a little bit of a glitch. Do you think I can get a retake? That's not how it works. It's not something where if you have minor issues, they're going to grant it to you. Typically what I'm seeing is that if you're able to get through the test all right and the disruption is what will be called minimal, they're not giving you a retake. When they give you a retake out is when there's a catastrophic failure where all of a sudden you're just out of the test. And then you're on the phone with ProctorU or LSAC, time goes by, and all of a sudden it's like, look, we can't get you back in there. That's the type of problem that's actually causing this. And be aware that if something like that happens where you do get kicked out, I know the first inclination is to want to call them. I have talked to them about this multiple times, and they are adamant that the best way to lodge a complaint when something like this happens is not to call, but to use the complaint form inside your LSAC account. According to them, they are watching that with kind of like higher level personnel every minute. They're looking to see stuff that comes in through that, and that's what gets acted upon. As I've said many times, when you call their phone number, you end up with these phone personnel, some of whom are more knowledgeable than others. And you can get somebody who's amazing, but every once in a while you get somebody who doesn't know. And so I think it's better to use the written form because you know it's being looked at by specialists who want to deal with the problem and say, all right, let me go take a look at this. Was this serious or not? Doesn't mean you can't follow up later on and be like, what's the status? But that to me is, and to them, according to what they told me recently, again, is the best way to actually deal with problems. Use the complaint form in the account.
Yeah, they've created that fairly recently in accounts to automate all of this for precisely this reason. What you just described, though, a little bit before the forum, the nature of what might qualify you or not for a retake, I will point out that there's a profoundly murky gray area in the middle here between what might be obviously minimal and obviously extreme or severe, catastrophic as we've called it.
Yep.
If you feel you've lost time or if you feel that your test was so adversely affected that you should qualify, submit the form. You're better asking. But don't ever go into this with the presumption that you're a guaranteed retake.
It's a good way of saying it.
Yeah.
It's kind of like trying to get into Yale. Nobody's guaranteed.
Yeah, my 4.0 and 180. I'm still biting my nails.
I mean, I think certain people are like, look, I just got kicked out after 5 minutes in the test and I can't get back in. They don't know how to reconnect me. We have to try again. That's pretty obvious. But I lost connection and then the proctor reset me back, but it was disruptive. You're probably not getting a retake.
Yeah, my proctor chimed in and started typing for 40 seconds, and I lost 40 seconds in games while I read his message. I don't know if that's going to qualify you or not. My guess is probably not. So it's case by case, basically.
Yeah, I don't think that would qualify. I wish the proctors wouldn't do that, though.
Dude.
I know many people agree with me. The proctor started playing around with my mouse. It's like, go away. I'm trying to take a test, bro.
Well, all right. The last thing I like that. If you have issues, there's essentially what you need to do.
Yeah, there definitely is. The last thing I thought was interesting about this test was that for the first time in a long time afterwards, I saw people on the forums expressing concern about the nature of the information being shared about the test. And I thought it would be useful if you and I talked about this for just a moment, because it is something that we share concerns about as well. And I think we've alluded in past podcast discussions about there are sometimes students who really badger us for information. They want us to tell us, where this came from, what the scale is going to be, what prep tests they should look at to get similar game setups. And I will reiterate that we kind of just use the friendly denial system with those people. Like, yeah, it's not gonna happen. We've made a pact to not talk about it. And again, we're not bound by rules that say that we can't. I didn't take this particular test, so I feel like I could talk about it. But it's more about a public good.
Yeah.
I don't want to bias people. And we don't think that this does bias people to talk about the test in this way. There are sometimes, though, people who don't realize what the rules are. And so let's kind of talk about that, because the way LSAC has kind of allowed things to operate over the years is that if you have a generalized conversation, they've said that that's okay. It's kind of like the unwritten rule. It's been going on for years and years. And what the generalities mean is that, hey, I had the section with the newspaper game. That's fine. Number 17 was D. That is not fine. It's a double linear setup, and there's 6 variables for 5 places. Not okay. You can really talk about sections in terms of their topics, their general difficulty, the order. You can talk about specific like game and reading comp and logical reasoning topics. But anytime you start going past like the surface, that's where the problem is. And we saw some posts this weekend that we were like, that goes a little bit too far, where they started to talk about you should look at prep test 71. That wasn't the test, but I don't want to give anything away.
Right.
For a identical setup to this game. That to me is a problem. Another problem, and I'm seeing this a lot more, is people saying, DM me, let's talk. I'm telling you, if you're one of those people that is doing that, it's not me that you have to worry about, but I can tell you for a fact that LSAC looks at these forums and they do not look kindly at people asking to talk about the test privately. So it's all right to say, hey, I had a reading comp passage about Kafka, but leave it at that. Or I found that Kafka passage really hard and it was the second one. That's okay.
Right.
Don't start talking about answers. Don't talking about game types, setups, et cetera, et cetera. Don't be asking for information privately like that either, because you're it's basically compromising us, and we don't want that.
Yeah, it compromises us, but more importantly, it potentially compromises the applicant. If you're a person who posts something about a DM and LSAC gets a little slippery with it, a little bondish, and they come in there and try to fake post to you. Be like, so what did you think about that third game? How'd you set it up? Did you have a lot of D in game 4? And you respond to that in the affirmative or whatever. You engage that, then suddenly you're on the hook for clearly violating this, and you'd be doing it right into their lap. So I'm always mindful of the fact that if they wanted to try to really catch people out, you're inviting them to do it to you if you start suggesting you want to have private conversations.
Yeah, and it's interesting because some of the people were saying you can't talk about it at all. So why does LSAC allow some conversation? And this is something that I've asked them before in the past, and I don't think it's a problem to kind of like mention this. But their view was this: if you don't allow some generalized conversation, like that test was hard, I hated Kafka, then what you're really inviting is for people to drive the whole conversation underground. And if that happens, the level of disclosure will be off the charts and completely unmanageable. So they know how people are. We all do. This is a way that's kind of like a pressure valve. It gives people the opportunity to at least talk a little bit about the test and express their feelings and their happiness or frustration, but it isn't prejudicial. And that's really the interesting point, is that a lot of times people say, like, well, you're giving advantages to other students if you come back from the test and disclose it. And you and I have said for a long time that that's a mixed bag. You go into this test and you've seen other people talking about it. I think that's actually one of the worst things you can do. I think it pre-biases you. It has you start looking for certain things that you want to find versus just doing the questions the way you should do them. So I don't find, in my personal experience from watching students do this, that it is actually helpful. That's a whole other conversation, though.
Yeah, we've talked about it before. If anything, it can be actively dangerous. But you're right. I mean, the alternative to being allowed to talk about topics publicly is them shutting everything down and pushing it private. And then the whole world opens up. I'm sure that already happens anyway, but the bulk of people aren't doing this behind the scenes.
No, whoever's doing it, it's probably a minimal amount of people.
Precisely. It's a tiny
And they
fraction.
know that by having a little bit of conversation, that actually satisfies the vast majority who are like, okay, yeah, I did feel that was hard. I'm glad other people did too.
Yeah.
And they can leave. I mean, that's a human response.
It's a reasonable compromise is what it is.
Yeah, there was a comment I saw that I thought was interesting. They were like, it's like a traffic violation where it's kind of like speeding, I think was the example. You can take it, everybody knows the limit's 55, but they don't arrest you for going 60 because it's within reason. But if you're going 85, yeah, you're getting a ticket, maybe jail, who knows?
Yeah.
So I think you have to look at it that way. It's like they're trying to minimize the overall sharing, and a little bit doesn't hurt, but don't go too far with this. And I think their concerns are reasonable. If somebody's like, you need to go study prep test 71, that's prejudicial and it needs to be stopped.
Yeah, behave as though you know there's a cop on that street, that 55-mile-an-hour stretch of road. How would you drive if you knew there was a cop about to radar gun you?
Yeah,
Again, a little over, but you'd be cautious. That's how you should behave in the days after the test.
Agreed. And I want to add one comment to something you said. We don't know that LSAC has baited anybody.
No, I was just suggesting.
That was not a factual thing. We were saying hypothetically, what if they did? I do know this. I know that they look at the forums.
Yeah.
That's a fact. You should be aware of that. You always, as John said, assume there's a cop on the road. What the cop decides to do is up to the cop, but just assume the cop's there and be careful.
Yeah,
in general.
I'm glad you actually brought that back up. I didn't want to suggest to anyone, although I do think a healthy dose of fear or suspicion is actually useful in this because it'll keep you honest. You don't know who the person on the other side of that screen is. LSAT catfishing you for information.
LSAC Catfish. It's a new TV show. Let's see if we can induce this person to give us a setup.
I'd watch that.
I think it would be fun for us. No one else in the world would enjoy it.
No.
But keep it general, keep it surface, you'll be fine. That's been the case. And on that note, let's dive into the LSATs that we saw during this long week.
Oh, yeah. On that note, I'm going to have a sip of drink. Hang on. All right. He's ready. Why don't we start
off?
Let's start overseas would be my vote. You cool with
that? That was my vote too. Let's start with the internationals. Some people had asked me, are you going to cover the international? Please do. I was like, of course we're going to cover the international tests. I've got love for the world. I would like to go out and visit it when this is all said and done with the pandemic. So we're most assuredly going to talk about this. And it's also, I think, a super easy conversation for us.
Yeah, this is the easiest of the bunch too. So it's not purely global love. Partly this was just a silver platter.
I'm going to start off with the easiest of them all.
Yeah.
So the international tests were primarily given around Wednesday in the U.S. Obviously, with time zone differences, some of these exams were really, really early. I think they started at like 1 or 2 in the morning U.S. time in some places. But what they used, for the most part, was a test that we are very familiar with, and that is the February 2016 LSAT. Now, again, I'll remind people that when we say that, and your first thought is, man, how do I get my hands on that? You can't. February 2016 was an LSAT that was non-disclosed. It means that they didn't release any of the questions. They didn't release the answer key. There is no information about it. We just happen to know which test that was because we've been doing this a long time and we pay attention and we know what the topics were in each of the sections. It's a test, John, that wasn't just used in February 2016 or in January here. They used it a couple other times, right?
They have, yeah. Many other times, in fact. This has been a pretty popular one in recent years. In fact, as soon as I saw the topic of the first game, I knew exactly what it was. It was still fresh on my mind from the latest usage, which was the October 2020 Flex here in America.
Yep.
So anyone who took the October 2020, there's a chance that week that you saw this test, or at least some portion of it. It was also used internationally in June of 2018 in Europe, used internationally in parts of Asia and Australia in February of 2018. So just in the past, I guess now about 3 years, we've seen multiple uses. This was at least the fourth time it's come up.
After the original usage. So, and I have to admit, when I woke up on Friday, and I saw that, sprawl and shrubs had been used in the RC, I was like, thank God I know that test.
No work for me. I'm going back to sleep.
Yeah, I was like, I need a few more minutes here. And then there was a reference to, London, Madrid, and Paris. And I was like, all right, I know exactly which test this is. So the question was, which of the logical reasonings did you get? But let's look at this exam. This was a very reasonable exam. We've actually talked about this exam previously. And what you have here is you had a game section that started off with a game about like a furniture sale. There's like lamps and tables, and they're being sold over a period of months. And then you go to a game about artists and 5 spots. It's kind of a game where they're putting them into order. Then you have a game about 6 people going to conferences in the 3 cities, which sound great, man. I would love to visit London, Madrid, and Paris anytime in the near future, especially Madrid, man.
Yeah.
And then the last game was about books on a bookshelf. The third game about the conferences is a tough game. Mm-hmm. But the section overall isn't unreasonable. So pretty fair. And we'll talk about the matrix for scoring this because it has its own scale in just a moment. Then we went on to reading comprehension, and we started off with a female sculptor. I think it's Edmonia Lewis.
That's right, yeah.
Followed up by government regulations. It's kind of like workplace ethics and employee rights. Then the very famous urban sprawl passage, which is the comparative reading. And then they close out with the shrubs and hedges. Again, it's a reasonable section, but the sprawl and the hedges are not the easiest passages in the world. And then you've got 2 LRs. One of them notable because it contains a topic that you and I both are interested in, that would be absinthe.
Yes, proper absinthe, wormwood absinthe.
Yes. And I think the last time we talked about this, we were like, hey, didn't we have absinthe when we were in Amsterdam one of those times?
Yeah. I've been told as much. I've seen some pictures.
Yes, the Green Fairy was out that night. All I remember about absinthe is strong.
Yes, it is.
Jeez. It is kind of cool, though, because you melt the sugar down into it.
Light it over
I need
the sugar
way
cube.
more sugar.
Yeah.
They needed to start with a sugar base and then melt the absinthe into it for me. This is a medium difficulty section. And then ultimately the other LR that's on that test was about like electronic toll systems and too many traffic tickets and altruistic behavior. Mm-hmm. So it looked to us like they were just using the games and the reading comp and then a lot of the absinthe passages, or LR rather. Mm-hmm. And then I think I saw some of the other one as well. But I will say this much. When we get down to the scoring matrix on this, every international scaling that was related to this test is -8 for a 170. Okay? And it works this way. Logic games, we start at -7. That's kind of like our standard default. Mm-hmm. Logic games doesn't add anything to this. Reading comprehension, I'd say it's going to add 1. And then the 2 LR don't add anything to it. So it moves from -7 to -8. And I'll just take a moment to remind everybody what that means. When we talk about test difficulty, we look at the top line. We try to look at the 170 level scores. So we are saying you could miss 7 questions to get a 170 as our baseline. And then as we look at sections, according to how easy or hard they are, and I'll come back to that in a moment, we either add or take away. This reading comprehension, we think, adds a little bit to it, moves it to -8. My comment about easy or hard, and I've made this last time, is it is relative.
Yes.
Everything on the LSAT to me is hard. Okay, so we're already in the upper tier of difficulty. I'm not saying this, if I say this section was easier than another, I did not say it was easy. Don't make the relative flaw there of thinking, oh, he said it was easy. That's not what we were doing. We think they're all hard. There's just gradations of difficulty. Some of these are much harder than others, but they're still, then they're super hard. And others are less hard than others. Still hard, but not quite as hard. It is all relative. So all international test takers, -8 for your scale. Overall, a pretty reasonable test, I'd say.
Yeah, I woke up to a text from you that's what they had just used internationally on Wednesday. And I had two thoughts, more or less the same. The first was, yay that we know. And the second was, yay that they use that test. Every time this test comes up, I'm happy about it because I think it is remarkably fair. Right down the middle, -8 is what I would say is not an overly generous curve, but reasonable. Nothing to be upset about, certainly. And the content here is exactly what you would expect to see. So all boxes I like to be able to check when talking about a test.
Yeah, so that is also a test that now I don't expect to see for a while. To use it both in October and then to use it again here, I think we won't see Feb 16 for a while, at least a year and a half, which is great in some respects because now I don't have to think about that test anymore. But it's sad to me because I'm like, we do know that test, I think, very well, and we understand a lot about how it is put together. So be it.
Yeah.
That takes us out of there. We're done. That's the international LSAT finished. That brings us to the domestic LSAT.
Here we are, back on the continent.
Which is kind of like the main event.
Yeah, back on the continent as always these days.
A lot more test takers.
Yeah, back home. So a lot more test takers. This is the vast majority of people. And this started Saturday morning. And this was another test, interestingly enough, that Saturday we were able to place pretty quickly because it's one that's been used a few times. Not as recently as the February 2016, last October. But certainly this test has got a little bit of notoriety or visibility about it, too. The first usage that I'm aware of, or at least the one we'll refer to this as, was that this was a test that was used in September of 2017 internationally, specifically in Asia. It was also used December 2017, so that same year, the next test in Europe, and about 2 years later in Europe as well, October of 2019.
And when you think about this, a lot of times people are like, well, what prep test, range should I study? This is exactly what we had said on our crystal ball, and we were asked many times, you're going to update it. I was like, I don't see the need to. I still think we're right about this, that we're looking at tests from like the early 80s, late 70s. This is right in that zone. And so as we look at that, I feel like they're doing what we kind of expected them to do. And this test as a whole, all these forms kind of fell into what I would almost say is like the meta that's occurring right now, which is, games is a little bit all over the place. It's usually a tough one. LR has always got some tough questions, and then RC is harder.
Mm-hmm.
So you started off with games. What did we see in those games? Like, what topically were they doing? Yeah,
the first stuff they started using Saturday morning from, again, what we'll call the September 2017 Asia test. It began with a game about musical performances, musicals. There was a game about apartment complexes and university buildings. I heard being locked and unlocked, something to that effect. There was a slightly harder game about paintings and sculptures in an art gallery with 2 levels and then 3 centuries, the 18th, 19th, and I believe 20th centuries. And then finally, there was one about artifacts and archaeologists. Archaeologists basically inspecting artifacts.
Yeah, and I think that third game, which you saw called a ton of different names, centuries, paintings, sculptures, art gallery. It has a lot of different names, but that was the game that was the toughest on this test.
Sounded like
Saw more complaints about that than anything else.
What did you think of that section as a whole? We'll get to reading competence section, but just in a second. What did you think? I mean, your initial impressions from people?
It's fair.
That's what I thought too. I was like, nothing there really stands out as like, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry for you.
And I know that if you took that section and struggled with it, you're cursing right now. And I'm sorry. It's relative to LSAT sections, though. Like I said, I think all logic game sections are difficult. So this isn't to say that it's easy. When I say it's fair, I don't think it had anything that was like brutalizing.
Right.
anything that was like, I am dead. It's always difficult though, and under time pressure, especially, everything seems much harder than it would otherwise. And I will remind people of this because I saw this a lot after the test where people were like, this was the hardest ever. I want to point this out. People say that after every LSAT, and it's completely natural because it's showtime. You're under the maximum pressure you're going to feel on an LSAT. Of course, everything feels outsized. If there's any difficulty, it doesn't feel like a little bit of difficulty. It feels like a tremendous amount. If you were taking it as a PT, you'd be like, all right, this is hard. But you wouldn't be like, I can't believe it. This is the worst ever. It's the experience of being under pressure with the test that leads to that emotional reaction. It's 100% normal. I'm not faulting anybody for it. I'm just saying when we take a look at the context and perspective of this, we have to like see past that part of the response, because there is every LSAT that I've ever dealt with, and that's a lot of LSATs, I've heard someone say it was the hardest that they'd ever seen, which is an amazing thing when you think about it, but it tells you something more about human nature than anything else.
Yeah.
So just keep that in mind. We always try to be conservative in our estimates. We try to be fair in how we assess things, but I don't want anyone to get a bad feeling and be like, I can't believe they said that was fair when it was really hard. Yes, I know it was hard, but relative to the hardness, it was fair.
Yeah, you mentioned context and human nature. And not to do too deep of a dive into the psychology of this, but also, listener, keep in mind that the place where you're likely to go to have your feelings, your suspicions validated turns into a bit of an echo chamber of other people who are online specifically because they had a uniquely difficult time with it. So I think a lot of times people were like, was that as hard as I thought? And they go online and everyone else is doom and gloom and the sky is falling. And then suddenly it seems to confirm your own fears or suspicions. The people who had a reasonable time with it, they're not suddenly on the keyboard, right? They're not typically on the forums and stuff. At least I don't see a whole lot of posts, an outsized number of posts that say things to the effect of like, felt good. Anybody else? Like, it's usually, that was pretty easy, or I killed it, or more commonly, oh my God, what in the world was that?
Yeah, there's a collective commiseration that occurs after these exams, and it's really comforting to hear other people be like, it was hard. It makes you feel like, all right, I'm not crazy. I had difficulty with it. Other people did too. That's completely normal. So that was our logic games that started off on Saturday morning. And then they pulled the reading comprehension from that same test, which we will continue to call September 17 International Asia Test.
Right.
In fact, they used this entire exam, all 4 sections of it. And so the reading comprehension, again, I don't think this was an easy section overall. It started off with kind of like the African cloth, the kente cloth, and the looming of that and weaving strips of fabric. Then you had computer-generated simulations in courtrooms in the U.S., kind of like electronic displays. And you had a passage I heard a lot of people complaining about, which was like the medieval music, the iconography passage. And then you also had a chemistry physics passage and kind of like the fundamental concepts and how compatible they were and electrons and some other stuff. Heard a lot of complaints about that. And what you're seeing a lot with reading comp these days is they've found an area that they can mine for difficulty. And it's not so much that the questions have to become super hard, it's that the density of the passage and the style of writing is hard to parse. It is hard to discern what they are saying. This is the easiest way to increase difficulty in an environment where people are preparing at the level people are preparing at these days. So much you can do for logic games and logical reasoning because of like the nature of those 2 sections. With reading comprehension, it's really hard to combat just a brutally hard passage to read. And you saw a lot of people saying that. It's like, I didn't enjoy the passages. They were hard. I didn't understand them. That's normal, at least at this point.
Yeah, it started with a curveball of sorts too, because the first passage here, the one about the African cloth strip weaving, the West African society looms, was tough. It was a very difficult point of entry into this section, and you really didn't get much of a break. I think the courtrooms, the computer simulations in courtrooms, was probably the easiest of the 4, from what I heard. But there really wasn't any let-up in this, the way that you might typically see.
Yeah, that's going to affect our curve as we get down to it. And then we get into some logical reasoning that appeared on that Saturday morning. And as we'll talk about with logical reasoning, it's muddled in here. And so I'm not even sure that the clarity for us is 100% across the board on all of this. But let's talk about what we saw on Saturday, because this was pretty clear, and we already had information on this test from when it was used in Asia from a couple of years ago.
Yeah, so some of this we could match up pretty clearly. One of the LR sections, let's just call it the first, this was the section that had animals and for-profit zoos. There was one about multiple languages, foreign languages, and poetry. The question that probably came up the most in this, I might say, was the one about walnuts in a diet. There was a study about fat and cholesterol and people eating walnuts. Cake mix was in there. There was one about a debate in a rec center if the property value would change and conflicts of interest and things. My two favorite questions in here, and I'll loop back to this as we'll see. You'll see why these are my two favorite. That's a little bit facetious. One had to do with bacterial survival in tap water at certain degrees, temperatures, and the other had to do with dinosaurs' raptor claws and climbing prey. And as Dave prefaced this, it's been a little bit of a trick for us to distinguish the cutoffs between different sections, in part because the topics get reused so much between them. And those two questions in particular, you will hear get mentioned again.
So I will just put a caveat out there. You can't see the word bacteria or dinosaurs and think that was my section.
Right.
You actually have to show some, further thought on this. And that sounds bad, maybe because it's so late. I don't mean it badly. I mean that the way the test is written is you have people writing topics and questions and so forth. Well, they like certain topics. I mean, how many times have we seen dinosaurs on this game? Or you go back a number of years ago, serotonin came up constantly for a while.
Yeah.
So you have these topics that are recycled, and I always think to myself, it's the same person who's writing this, and they just are manufacturing different stimuli. Well, that happens on tests like this. And sometimes it's really easy to say, oh, bacteria, I had that question. The point here isn't that you had a bacteria question, it's which one did you have? And so that sometimes makes it really difficult. And that also is one of the reasons why when people are talking about the test afterwards, I sit there and I'm like, be careful, because you don't know that you're actually seeing and hearing the same thing that someone else, saw and heard. And so I know there were multiple bacteria questions out there. In a sense, we actually thought about whether or not we even mentioned something like that, because it's like that would immediately ring bells for two different groups of people. But this is really the section about the animals in the zoos, the poetry and the languages, and the walnuts and the fat. If you can focus on those, that was your section. I think this was a fair section, though, John. So there's some difficulty, as always. Those three questions I mentioned, I know are all hard, but overall, not a bad section.
Yeah, this one didn't. And it's funny, some of the questions we're mentioning probably gives real triggers through people. Part of the reason we have these questions to identify is they're the ones that come up the most. And oftentimes that's because they're the most difficult, the ones people lingered on or had to revisit or flag. So if the questions we're reading make you think about the difficulties through that lens, know that there were still another 22, 23 out there that should have tempered it. But this was a fair section, is probably how I would describe it. Not easy, but not the hardest that we saw through the week.
So what was the other section that we saw on that early Saturday?
Yeah, the fourth and final section, the second LR from September 2017 Asia, also used Saturday, was the one with red maple trees, leaf decomposition. A question I would really like to read about dog personalities and how people match the dog personalities to their own. Another question that I saw get mentioned a lot was about squirrels, I think silver squirrels and brown squirrels. And the fourth and maybe final question that got a ton of attention was about Orwell, childhood involvement in sports teams, but George Orwell was in there. There were some other ones as well, healthy tomato soup, sea lions being eaten by sharks and orcas. But
that's the question I want to read.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, it wasn't exclusive to dog personalities. That one just stood out.
Yeah, so again, to me, it's like this is the Orwell red maple tree section. Once you lock in on that and you think about, did I have those questions? That's the section we're talking about. And you and I had a conversation on Saturday that we felt that this section, based upon what we know about it, especially from prior appearances of this test, is that this is the harder of the two LR sections.
Yeah, that's what I felt.
So if you had kind of like the animals in the zoos and the poetry languages section, not to say again that that was easy, but that was relatively easier. This second section with the red maple tree was the harder of the two sections. And at that point, they'd used all four of the sections from this September 17 Asia test that was floating around out there. So I think on the weekend, as we were kind of getting underway on Saturday, we felt pretty good because we're seeing this, and this is something that we're familiar with. I don't know this test as well as Feb 16 because not as many people have taken it, but I feel comfortable with it, and I, again, feel it is a reasonable test.
Yeah,
overall.
yeah. I wasn't. Nothing about this test unnerved me. For the people out there experiencing it, I thought again it was a pretty fair experience. And I'm sure there's people ready to throw their phone through a window right now, but. It wasn't as bad as it could have been. Certainly, I think it was in line as well. By the way, you mentioned it before, with other tests through the 80s or tests like the international test that we saw, the February 2016. All of these tests, to me, I think are fairly sibling in their construction.
And I have to agree. We're not seeing anything that's like incredibly easy or incredibly hard within the range of LSATs. And that's what we've been predicting in our crystal balls, and they're adhering to that.
Yeah.
Do I think that changes at some point? Yeah, I do.
Sure.
I think we have to expect that's going to occur. I don't think it'll really start occurring until we see an experimental section return, whether that's through changes in the Flex or whether that's from the advent of in-person testing coming back. So...
Yeah. Speaking of predicting, you and I were in constant contact through Saturday, and both of us were predicting that at some point that day, something had to change, something new would get introduced. And we were not disappointed.
But we were disappointed in what it was.
Yeah.
Again, reading comprehension and logic games are so easy to identify because somebody says, urban sprawl, and you're like, I know that passage. And so I love to see new reading comp and logic games introduced because usually we can figure it out virtually instantaneously. But they did not introduce those on Saturday that we saw. We saw new logical reasoning pop up toward the later part of the day. And this section is, I'm not really sure, Jon, about the origin of this section, to be honest with you. I can't point to a specific test and say this was previously used here.
Yeah, I couldn't track this one down either. I had a hard time even distinguishing it at first because the first two questions that I heard about were about bacteria and dinosaur raptors. So I was like, oh, it's more of that from this morning. It turns out, no.
Yeah, I think we were casually like the same section.
Yeah.
And then we realized it wasn't the same section.
No, it was not.
In part because there's a question in there about Leibniz and Newton and calculus, which I don't know how to describe it. Shouldn't be there. It is a question that is very similar, if not identical, to a question from Prep Test 31. And seeing that and the discussion of it was very unusual. And that's probably, again, that was the discussion that probably went too far. But I wonder about that. I don't, it's really hard to do a question and then go look at something else that's similar. Maybe the same guy wrote the question and there are differences that people didn't notice and so forth. But that would be that section. And apparently some other question topics in there were about processed cereals and nutrition. There was about a question about donations and disasters and 10% being kind of like the donation number and employees getting positive feedback to make sure the employees work harder, things like that. Mm-hmm. So this section, I'd say overall very fair from what we know about it. I'll be interested to see, if this comes back later on or exactly what's going on with some of the questions here.
Yeah, to draw maybe a finer line between the two, the bacteria question in this new section from Saturday afternoon was about bacteria in soil, not tap water from the morning, but more about temperatures, freezing temps versus room temperatures and whether they can survive or not. The dinosaur raptor question in this case was about fleas, little pests on the dinosaurs, as opposed to earlier where it was about claws and climbing prey. But again, you can see if you describe these with a single word or two, it's very easy to make them indistinguishable.
And I got to ask the question, are they doing that on purpose? I mean, I would if I was them. And I always give them the credit of having intent behind all of this. I'm like, I consider them the master manipulators of creating things and feints and things like that, of kind of like drawing people off guard. So I think that it happens naturally, but I don't think it bothers them when they're like, oh, look, over the course of 4 days, we're going to have 3 questions in different sections that are all about bacteria, as
tomatoes,
the case might be.
yeah.
Yeah, or tomatoes, another one that we saw.
Yep.
But I also think that, again, it is coming from the fact that there are people who are very knowledgeable about certain topics. And if you're knowledgeable about topics and you're making LSAT questions, you're going to rely on those topics. And there's no harm in it.
Yeah.
As long as you read the question, it doesn't really make a difference if it's the same topic as something you've seen elsewhere.
It also suggests to me, given how historically with release tests, when we've seen the same topic get repeated, it do often come in clusters. Do you remember like 2 or 3 years in a row where there are 3 different passages on bumblebee dancing and waggle dances and stuff?
Mm-hmm.
It makes me wonder if when we start to see these degrees of overlap on these tests, despite them being non-released, if they've been taken from a chronological pool of creation that's a relatively short timeline.
Could be.
If that makes sense. Like one person wrote a whole bunch about salt. And so it went into 2 or 3 different tests, back to back to back. That was another
and I laugh
one,
because that's another question that's floating around out there. That's like,
Yeah.
Seems to be salt licks, things like this, salt crystals. Was another topic of some multiplicity.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, we got through Saturday, and I felt like overall it was a really good test day. There were some problems with the kind of like the proctoring and so forth, but given the volume, it wasn't bad. And I felt like the tests themselves that I was seeing were pretty reasonable. Now, we knew that once they started to introduce new sections, they'd continue to do that.
Yeah.
And then we'd see more mixing and matching. And so that does continue to happen. So just because we talk about a section as appearing on Saturday doesn't mean it was the only day that it was used. We saw these sections, like the Orwell logical reasoning section, used all the way through today.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just when it appeared. We talk about that chronologically, and then at the end, we'll do a complete matrix breakdown. But then we get up on Sunday. I'm already tired after like 15-hour day. And the first thing that I see is new reading comprehension right out of the gate. This one, though, made me a little bit happier. I'm not sure people taking it felt that way, but it made me happy because I'm a big fan of Franz Kafka as an author. I particularly like The Trial. That's probably one of the most interesting books that was ever written to me. And, of course, everybody knows the Metamorphoses. And, you know, he's turned into basically a big bug. Yeah. So he's a fascinating author, just the ultimate doom and gloom kind of guy. But the reading comprehension is, you know, you've got Kafka and it's the comparative reading, and it's not an easy passage.
Yeah.
There's a passage about the Big Bang Theory and ever-expanding universe. There's one about kind of like, it's a law-related passage about policy evasion in the environment and dumping pollutants. And then there's a passage about diplomacy and I think UN diplomats that is in here. The problem is none of these are necessarily all that easy. It's not that the section contains anything that's just mind-bending. It's just that they're all kind of hard.
Yeah.
And again, this reminds me of the other section that we've already talked about where it's like there's just no easy RC right now. They all seem to come in with a higher level of difficulty. And this has been going on for so many tests now that, if you're heading towards February or April, you're going to have to assume that you're going to see a harder RC on average because that's where the focus is for difficulty right now.
Yeah. So what do you practice for that? You may be wondering. Same thing we've been telling you to practice, which is tests in the 80s. That is the era that these are reminiscent of right now. And sure enough, no surprise, because this RC actually came from an experimental in September 2018.
Very recent.
There you go. It's around, what, test 86 or so?
Yeah. So, you're looking at tests that they're pulling this right out of the modern era. And I always get this question, what should I study? What should I study? And I always say the same things, at least for the last several months. Make sure you're locked in on the 80s. The RC and the LR are very much what we're seeing on every one of these tests. And the games, for the most part, are right in line with this too. Mm-hmm. So at the very least, start there and know those, and then move backwards into the 70s and so forth.
Yeah, this was tough. Now, we've talked about 2 RCs, and it's, I'm sure, natural for people to wonder, well, which one was harder? Which one was maybe preferable? Did I luck out by getting the Saturday or the Sunday? I thought these were so eerily similar to one another that I'm not sure I could actually draw a distinction between the two in terms of difficulty.
I think from where we sit, really difficult to do that. I probably would say that the first one with the African cloth is slightly harder, but that's to do a disservice to the Kafka one.
Yeah.
So if I'm saying that, it's because one of them is like a 97 and the other's a 96. They're so close. It's like grading wine. Yeah, it's meaningless at that level. They all taste good. With reading comp, they're all difficult.
Yeah, I had a student ask me about this earlier in the week after they had taken the test privately, asking me which was the harder because they could clearly see two sections occurring. And I said, honestly, difficulty at this point, I think, mostly comes down to individual preference. You'd probably be, I don't want to say better, because that assumes a difference in performance, but you'd probably prefer, Dave, the Kafka section. It's because you like Franz more than you might know about African kente cloth weaving.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's a bit presumptuous on my part, but I think I'm safe. Kafka.
You never know. I really like fabrics, and I'm a big fan of like soft, supple fabrics. So maybe I would have liked that cloth one.
You and your textiles. But Kafka, I think, is probably going to be a little more comfortable for you. He's the real ray of sunshine we need right now, by the way. I would probably have preferred the one about the Big Bang Theory in this same section as Kafka, because it's written by my boy Neil deGrasse Tyson, or at least it was based on an essay of his. Something I've probably read. But again, that doesn't make it easier. It probably just makes it preferable for me. And that's what I saw a lot of the difficulty hinging on here, is just where people felt more comfortable, not necessarily what was objectively harder or less so.
Yeah, and some of these I'm indifferent to in terms of topic, like the environmental policy invasion. It sounds interesting to me. It's kind of stuff that I am interested in, so I probably would have been fine with it, but it's not anything that I'm like seeking when I'm looking into a reading comp, like, oh, I'm so glad that's there. I'm like, okay, good.
Right. What about the games? This was the other new thing we saw introduced Sunday morning. A second set of games appeared.
Yeah, and I think what's happened here, this is my speculation, and it is not confirmed, is that there were 2 4-section tests that were in use for the most part. We've already talked about the other one, which was this September 17th Asia test. So we know that's floating around. This other exam that they have pulled together, they've used pieces of it. Like we said, they used it as September 2018 experimental. I think the LR sections that we've seen also have like origins around that same period of time. And the logic games, this is a really interesting section to me because we have seen this before, but it goes back so far that I know that they must have been fiddling around with it still. This section and some of the games on it first appeared in October of 2010 as experimentals. Yeah. Which, if you are thinking, that's a long time ago, yeah, you're right. I agree. It's also amazing to me because I was like, we've got great information on that game from 10 years ago. I was like, I love having a history with what we do here and being able to look back at this. But I think what they did was they put those out as experimentals and then made some changes. And I believe probably what we have is a complete LSAT here that we may see sometime in the future. So who knows, maybe in 3 years we'll be talking about, yeah, we saw this in the January 2021 Flex test. But this game section was very interesting. It started off, as I recall, with a game about math and physics classes during a semester.
Yeah, science classes or something, I think.
Yeah, then it moved to a game about lawyers and cases and litigants. Here's the thing, though. Nobody complained about these 2 games that I saw. Everybody felt really good. The history that we have on them is that they're so straightforward and comfortable that they're non-notable. Like, there's just not that much detail about them. The third game is where we start to see people having a little bit more difficulty, and this is the kind of game about the doctors, nurses, and social workers. This was a step up in difficulty from the first 2. And then we get to the last game, and this is the one that for sure appeared back in 2010. And this is a game about like journalist articles in a magazine. Maybe it might be a newspaper.
I think it's a newspaper.
And they continue on different pages. Like there's an initial set of pages, and then there's a continuation on a set of pages that is, a good degree away. And this game is unquestionably difficult. It does have similarities to another game that they have put out there recently, and I'm not going to go into detail about that because I just don't feel like that's fair to anybody who might see it in the future.
Right.
But this became known as like the newspaper game, and I think that's a fair way of classifying it. And this section was like, did you get newspapers? And you saw this was a lot like the Shredder section to me, where all of a sudden it became all about the last game being really difficult and very hard to set up and a lot of confusion. And so we know that that game was hard. And if you felt that it was hard, you are correct. I did see some people come out and be like, I didn't think that game was hard at all. And I think there's an inference in there that really helps you solve that game if you see it. Problem is not everybody sees it.
Right.
It's kind of like that dinosaur game, like with the Maw of Dinosaurs. If you see one of the inferences in there, it makes the whole game a lot easier and much more manageable. But if you don't, the whole thing's a struggle. And I feel like that's what we have in this section. But I will remind everybody when we get to the matrix, you can kind of see what's coming. The first two games, when you have a section like this where the first two games aren't bad, you have to expect something harder is coming. That's the first rule. The second thing is that means you just scooped up a bunch of points early on and you're able to arrive at these later games with a little bit more time. I had students who were like, I got to that last game and found it hard. I also had 13 minutes to do it.
Yeah.
And that means that the difficulty becomes really hard. I hate sections like this where it's like some super easy stuff, again, relative, and then some super hard stuff. And that's absolute. And then trying to figure it out from that particular point. And it's like, how do you actually rate something like that?
It becomes very difficult to square the two, to balance it all out. Because obviously when we do these predictions, we're having to talk about it on the whole. We can't say like this one thing was so hard it eclipsed the section itself.
Yeah, and I find that challenging. And I think we'll try to talk about that in the matrix a little bit. And that automatically means that as you're thinking about your possible scalings, there's going to be a little bit of looseness built in on this, a little bit of variability. We may say it's minus this, but then think, well, it could be a little bit looser than that. But we'll come back to that. The interesting thing is at that point, we'd seen 2 games, 2 reading comprehension. We've seen 3 logical reasoning. We were kind of looking for a 4th logical reasoning.
Yeah, to round out the set, basically.
Yeah, we think it was there. It's really hard to see this. And this, I think for us, especially Sunday afternoon when it gets later on in the day, you and I were both flagging at that point. I think we were having a hard time focusing.
Yeah.
But it looks to me like there was another LR that came out, and this was one that was involved like academic fraud and plagiarism. There was something about a prime minister in there. There was another one about tax codes. There was another question about tomatoes. This was not the only tomatoes question of the weekend, by the way. There was an earlier one as well.
Yeah, I believe this was tomatoes, whether they're a fruit or a vegetable.
Yes, I think that is exactly the case here.
They're a fruit,
and so this was another LR that we saw in here, and I think that this is the second of the LR from the kind of like second shadow test that we have.
Yeah, so elephants get brought up a lot. I'm pretty sure this was that was in this section as well.
Is that the one about the pandas are in there too?
I believe there was something about pandas.
Might be, yeah.
Mosquitoes, perhaps.
You see, this is where it gets difficult, is like, you can see just us talking about it, we're like, wait, what was that? What was that? It's hard to keep track of all this. And so, if you're thinking, I'm not sure that was the case, that's okay. You have to, use your own judgment in terms of like analyzing this. But to us, it looks like there was 2 reading comp, 2 logic games, 4 reading comprehension, which would make 2 regular LSATs in their entirety and would make a ton of sense.
4 logical reasoning, but yeah.
It would also be something a little bit unprecedented because recent tests have had 45, they've had 54 variations. This one, despite its size, drops down to 16 possible combinations. And I'm hoping that what has happened here is that they have realized, look, nobody's able to cheat on the flex. It's just not a realistic concern. I know they were concerned about it. I know cheating is a huge issue for them. But I think they've realized that the multiplicity of sections makes it too difficult for anyone to really figure things out and to really even get an advantage by knowing things such as topic beforehand, which goes back to our combination earlier. It's like, as long as the information's general, I don't think anyone really gets an advantage. It's more like, oh, okay. So,
yeah.
And I will point something out. Sorry, John.
No, it's fine.
You see a lot of people online saying things like, I had the same order. Your test order doesn't mean anything. And I don't mean that brutally. I just mean sometimes I'm like, I try to help people out online and be like, hey, well, they were doing this. And after a while, I'm like, I can't post this for the 50th time. That section order is meaningless. You and I could take the test, John, and have identical section order and have completely different tests in terms of content.
So I saw a lot of those posts where somebody was like, I had this test, I had reading comp, logical reasoning, logic games, found it was really tough, but, I did my best. We'll see. And I'll hear the first comments, I think I had the same test as you. I'm like, how in the world
you don't know,
possibly
man.
know that?
You don't know. That's in a regular world, where we're doing in-person tests, yeah, you would have the same test, but not on the Flex where they flip things around constantly.
Right.
But looks like 16 outcomes here. And on that note, let's get to the scaling.
I want to make one final point for anyone tracking the timeline of what Dave's just laid out for you. It also means that by the end of the day on Sunday, they were done as far as introducing any new test content for this week. Everyone who tested past Sunday tested on something that was seen over the weekend. It didn't make my life or Dave's life any easier because we were still on the hunt for new content to appear, but it never did. It was all some combination of those 10 sections or whatever it was before. 8 sections, sorry, before.
Yeah, I assumed that we were about to see a new test on Tuesday.
I did too.
And that would have taken us to 54 combinations with another reasoning games and 2 LR. So to some extent, it was interesting because we talked throughout the day on this and we're like, wow, we've gotten late in the day on the Pacific Coast and there has been no change. But again, I don't think you can gain an advantage in terms of like the information that is out there even after the weekend. And, if you go in there, a lot of people were saying, well, I knew the newspaper game was hard, but I couldn't do anything about it. It still was hard to me. Knowing that it's hard doesn't help. Just tells you, well, this is going to be a challenge.
Right.
But it's going to be a challenge anyway.
Yeah, even today with the accommodated testers, as we record this today, they got some version of the combinations of what we just talked about. There was nothing new even today, Thursday.
That's exactly right. So they continued on with that. So let's talk about the scaling matrix, and then we'll close it down because I'm tired and I need a drink. My throat's dry. So remember how we do these matrices that we work through with this. We start out with a baseline of you can miss 7 questions to get a 170. All right, the good news is none of the sections that we saw tighten the scale. So everything we're going to have is going to be looser, or at least right now at 7 or looser. So let's talk a little bit about it. And Jon, I know you always like to make this point. I'll just jump in.
Do it.
We're always conservative. All right, I'd rather say that it's tighter than it's going to be, as opposed to giving somebody the idea that it's super loose and then it turns out that it's not. So keep that in mind. This is always built around the idea of it's better to be conservative than loose on this.
Yeah, the way I put it to somebody the other day is that we tend to round down. So if it's -7.5, we're going to say -7, when -8 would be theoretically as reasonable.
And also, we have a real problem. You and I were talking about this beforehand because I know that we have some agreement here on terms of like where the difficulty is. The way this is built for ease of understanding is binary. You're either adding one, you're having no effect, or you're removing one from the scale. Yeah. That's not really how we feel about these, though. Sometimes we're like, that would be half a point. But that would put people in a really rough situation of like, well, my scale was 8.5. What does that mean?
Right. Yeah.
I'm like,
technically not binary, but it is in whole numbers.
You know what I mean.
I knew what you meant. Sorry.
My fatigue is getting
it's
to
too
me
late.
at this
yeah,
point.
It's too late to give you a hard time. I'm sorry.
It's like the end of a 4-hour class where I've been like working all day and then added that on top of it. I'm tired. So let's start off. We start off at -7. Let's get into the logic games.
Okay.
So the first section was that September 17 Asia test. This was like the musical performances, the paintings and sculptures, the archaeologists and artifacts. This was a reasonable section. This section has no effect on the scale. It stays at -7. Here's where we're going to get some controversy. The other logic game section. This is the one where the third game is about doctors, nurses, and social workers, and the fourth game is the newspaper game. I'm not even sure you and I agree on this entirely.
I don't think we do. Not entirely.
To me, this is at least, probably a half point added. I don't think it's a full point because, again, I think the first 2 games were easy enough that it offsets, but I'd probably put it in the middle. But because of the way we're doing this and we're going on the conservative side, what it's going to add is nothing. And again, a bunch of people just threw off there.
Cue outrage. Pandemonium.
But I want everybody to just take a moment and listen to what we're trying to say there is we actually do think this is harder than the other section. We think it adds a bit to the scale. That will affect the scaling as it goes down into like the 160s and the 150s. This really isn't comparable to the first one. It's not 0, 0. This is like 0.5. So if you want to kind of like ride that idea, go ahead with it.
Yeah.
Just keep that in mind, is that it's a little bit harder. There isn't kind of like an accommodation for that in the way that we're thinking. It's just not easy for us to do it within the system that we're using.
Right. The comment I'll make on it briefly is that the reason I could see this potentially adding a point to the 170 type person is that's exactly who would be most affected by a game that no one could solve.
Yeah. And I think that's reasonable to look at here. Let's go to reading comprehension. Only 2 sections. We've talked about both of them already as being difficult, and so they're both going to add 1 to the scale. So if you had the African cloth, courtroom simulation, medieval music, iconography, and the chemistry and physics, that adds 1 to your scale. So that would move you from 7 to 8. And if you had Kafka, the Big Bang, the diplomacy, the environmental evasion of policy, that also adds 1. I think that probably... that takes you to -8 no matter which way. And if you had that harder of games, now you're thinking maybe I'm 8.5 that's floating around in here. Let's do logical reasoning. And then, John, we'll be near the end.
Yes, sir.
So, again, I think we disagree perhaps on this. The first logical reasoning, the one about like the walnuts and the fat and the poetry and the languages and the zoos, we're going to call that 0, no impact. The second one with the red maple trees and Orwell and the squirrels and the seals and orcas, etc., this is where we have a little bit of disagreement.
Yeah.
I think, again, we'd call this 0.5 if we had a perfect world on this. Because I don't think it's 0. I think it's harder than the other one. Is it a full point? Maybe. Maybe not. What's your take?
My take is I would feel very comfortable calling it a full point if you combine it with the newspaper game section. I think if you had that particular combination, bump it up 1.
Yeah. I think that definitely does that for you. That would take you to -9. So if you had the newspaper game, obviously whichever reading comp you had, and then you add in this red maple trees and Orwell, that's a -9 scale in our opinion. I think that's the best way we can try to say this. It may not add up exactly when we're doing 0s and 1s, but that particular configuration is going to be -9. And interestingly else, everything else is going to be -8.
Yeah.
I think that's the way it all plays out. It's that one configuration that looks harder than the others. But the other 2 LRs, the Leibniz, the 10% donation, the other LR that we talked about with like academic fraud and elephants and so forth, those look like fairly reasonable. They don't add anything to the scale. So mostly going to be looking at -8, except for that one specific combination, which is going to, I'd say, move to -9.
Yeah. I'd be surprised if any of these got you to -10. Some of those -8s I could see maybe creeping up, depending on what happened in that game section. But that's, yeah, I mean, it's funny. When you say we disagree, I think we mostly just disagreed about a half-point nudge here and there.
You know what we really disagreed about? The best way to present this.
Yeah, that's probably what it was.
I think we agreed about the difficulty. We're like, how do you actually present this in the clearest way?
Yeah, the more you talked about it, the more I just found myself like subconsciously nodding along. So yeah, clearly that's a good sign.
That's the way that it is. Like we can have a perfect agreement on this and feel like we know what we're doing, but still trying to explain it sometimes is a real challenge. And I'll be honest, John, I think the difficulty of us tracking tests, if we didn't have the prior information that we have, I think this would be impossible. It would be incredibly difficult for us to make some of the insights that we're able to make and to assess the difficulty. One of the questions that we get repeatedly is, how do you do it? Like, how do you make the predictions? And I've tried to explain this to people before. I'm like, it has a lot of different components to it. But we're also sitting on a database of information about prior tests that I know for a fact is unparalleled. No one else has the information that we have going back as far as we have. And that is like the base that we use. And we kind of are able to take it from there. And I think if we didn't have that, it would be a real challenge. But, It's the flex tests are the hardest thing I think that we've ever dealt with because you've got 3-4 test days. It's all day. It changes. And that's just a tough thing to actually keep an eye on. So,
yeah, we're in as fortunate a position as you can get. I mean, to be able to say that newspaper game first appeared in October 2010 as an experimental, one of the experimental sections. That's just a remarkable archive to be able to go back through. At the same time, man, it's still brutal to try to track all of this as clearly as we would like to. So when I see February 2016 get reused, it's, I launch balloons. It feels great.
Yeah.
When I see new stuff come in, obviously the scramble begins.
That is the scramble. And I don't think it's overstating it to say that no one else in, the LSAT world beside the test makers knew about when that game first appeared. And fortunately, we had information on it, and I was able to figure it out pretty quickly. But I will point something out, is that it's hard to be perfect with this stuff. So, take it with a grain of salt. And a number of you had salt-based questions, over the last week. So that has a double meaning for you. But the bottom line is that it's hard for us sometimes to actually track every little thing down to the nth degree. And so when you're listening to this, especially if you disagree, if you're like, no, that newspaper game was so hard, it definitely made this section the hardest I've ever done, add something to your scale then. If you're like convinced of that, you have to go with how you actually feel about it. But remember, every LSAT is tough. You're always going to feel bad after you come out of the test. It's almost a universal thing. And so it is natural to feel that way. Try not to let that influence your feelings so much and try to look at it with that cold, clinical view that you get in the aftermath where you can analyze what you've done. And hopefully this helps. And this is why we do these podcasts, is to try to help people like suss their way through all of this and figure things out.
Yeah, hopefully we've achieved at least some small portion of that. I think we have. But again, these things are notoriously sticky.
It's a challenge. Well, the good news is we do know when scores are coming out.
Yes.
And that is on February 3rd at roughly 9 a.m. Eastern time is when they'll shoot all those out. And these days they come out pretty quickly. It's not like a long multi-hour process. So set your calendars for that. And if you have score preview, if this is your first time, you'll get an opportunity to see your score at the same time. And then you'll have time to make a decision as to when or what to actually do with your score, whether to keep it or not. So other than that, that closes the book on the main testing event for the January 2021 LSAT-Flex. And I'm glad it's over.
Yes, me too. It's a happy book to close. The final thing I'll say about it, too, because I know for a lot of people this was genuinely their last LSAT. Don't really have that so much in June, July, August, when people are mostly gearing up into the cycle and likely to take it again. But for those of you listening to this was your final test, congratulations. We are proud of you from a distance. I know how difficult this all is, what a journey it is, what a challenge it is. So for those of you who've gotten to the end of the line and crossed it, well done. You have a lot to be proud of.
You really do. And this is the last LSAT that a number of the top schools will take, too. So for a lot of people, this was their last chance to kind of like change the game, change their status within the process. And we certainly hope that things went well. A lot of schools still take February, so if you're signed up for that, that is useful on two fronts. You can actually use it for your first application to a number of schools, a growing number of schools every year. And then February is also useful if you've already applied with an LSAT score, and then you want to change, say, your position if you haven't been accepted yet, or if you have been accepted, a new LSAT score from February or even April can help change that financial negotiation position that you have.
Get that money.
Yeah, and I've been seeing a lot of people who are like, look, I'm done with the LSAT, I thought, but I think I'm going to take April because I know I can do better. I think I'm going to get into some of these schools, but if I have April, I might be able to like get some more money out of them. And that is a tried and true strategy. So sometimes people think I'm done with the LSAT, and then they're like, man, the lure of like $50,000 more in financial scholarships, aid, what have you, I think I can suffer another LSAT. So if you come back, we won't hold it against you.
Yes, we will try to help you, however. So let us know if you do come back. We're around. But in
You're
the meantime,
back. What are you doing?
I know, right? Go away.
I've said that before, that one of my favorite things to say to people is, it's been great knowing you. You're done with the LSAT. I don't ever want to talk to you again. And I don't really mean that, but I mean it in the sense of, I don't want to have to like do LSAT questions with you. I want you to be done with it. So, all right. Any final comments, Jon?
No. I mean, congrats on another week. The two of us just getting through it feels miraculous. The 27,000 people did as well is, well, we can all count our blessings.
Yes, it's time for us to dive back into recording course videos and talking concepts and LSAT questions, which is something that I think I'll enjoy a little bit more than this.
I honestly thought you were going to say dive back into a bottle.
No, that's happening right now.
Okay.
All right. If you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else you may find it in the world. And if you get a chance and you enjoyed it, leave us a comment. And if you have any questions, you can send those to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. On behalf of Jon and myself, thanks so much for listening. Have a great week. Stay safe.